Hello everyone, Anita here and welcome to another art chat. Now today we're going to talk about, or rather I'm going to demonstrate to you how I do flat washes in watercolor. Now I've got this idea from a recent live stream where somebody asked me, how I do flat washes, how I do gradients that are so flat and how I mix my colors. And it's really hard to actually respond to that without showing, and I was using different paints at that time. So I figured, I'm just going to make an art chat about it. It's a perfect topic. It kind of continues also from the color charts that we've been doing a while ago. So what I've prepared here are 2 pieces of watercolor paper, and this is a 185 gram arch paper. Maybe a little bit too light for making flat washes, but I've pre-stretched it, so it should be okay. By pre-stretching, I basically mean that I just wetted it and dried it in, lazy way. I also have my watercolors, but we're not going to be using this pan, it's just for decoration, because I've already pre-mixed 2 colors. There's this mix of all kinds of pinks and reds and blue. Just to have, the same color in different situations. We're gonna compare it later. I also have my trusty heat gun, a pen that we're going to be using a bit later. It's a fine liner, the Unipin fine liner I usually use. I have 2 paint brushes. One is apparently it's a size 40, it says over here. And it's a flat brush. It's just a typical hobby brush. I don't use flat brushes that much, so, and especially that big. So this one is perfect for me. The most important part is that it's soft, so it's really good for watercolor. And then I have this round brush, and it's a colibri brush. As you can see, it's really, loved because the writing completely rubbed off. But it's a size 8 colibri brush, and they're really good for the things we're going to be doing today. I also have, some toilet paper, just the usual, and a container of water, which is a little bit here to the side. So I'm going to be doing this completely in real time so that you can see exactly what I'm doing, and I'm going to try and talk you through it a little bit, at least to the best of my abilities. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do just the basic of the basic flat wash, full coverage. It's best for backgrounds, sky, that kind of things. I also do it when I mask things with a masking fluid, like shapes. So basically when I have the ability to do one flat wash, I will use the bigger brush. And what I will do, the most important tip here is to have your colors prepared. Because the time you have for working this is rather, low. Watercolor dries really fast, especially that I'm working on a dry surface. So, you have to kind of make haste. So I'm wetting my brush, I'm loading it with paint very well. As you can see, it's very, very heavy with paint. And then I'm just applying it in quick strokes. I'm going over the areas where I've been. I can go up or down. Sometimes, a certain motion is better than the other. For example, for my rainy hydrangeas painting, I have used the top to bottom motion because that kind of emphasized the the rain. It's really hard to work here. I have my microphone just like here. I'm working over it, so it's a little bit awkward. We're gonna manage though. And then I'm going to dry my brush. And I'm going to pick up any kind of stray paint that might have been left. And there you have it. There's your perfectly flat wash. There's nothing more flat than this. And it's really, really easy to achieve when you're using a big brush. So the basic tips here are, this is a small surface. I didn't need much paint. But it's always really, really handy to have your paint pre-mixed for this. And also always pick up the the paint with a dry brush after you've finished painting. And the reason for that is so, I don't know, perhaps you like it. I mean, don't take my word for to be law. This is only my way of doing things. I absolutely love flat washes. So any kind of blooming, I hate blooming. I hate when colors bloom. I absolutely love the flattest of the flattest wash. And this is the flattest you can get. So I always make sure to pick up any kind of paint residue or paint leftovers, I suppose, with a dry brush. And this can be created. The water can pool around the edges. Usually I see it a lot around where the tape is touching the paper. That's where the water pools. That's where I get the excess paint, and that's where I usually make sure to pick up the paint. Now, the other way to do this, and I've been doing this for a very long time, especially when I'm lazy enough not to, mask the things, and here I will use my fine liner. Let's say I have, a shape. And this is especially good for shapes that are in some way, let's make it a little, that are in some way rooted to the bottom or the top, to the edge. Because what I will be doing right now, I'll be using the smaller brush to make the exact same flat background, but around this shape. Now this is, perhaps in this case, you could maybe use this brush just to maneuver yourself around the edges. When you have, for example, just a circle in the middle of paper, it's also easy to maneuver the big brush around it. This is just an example, but if you, for example, have a very detailed outline, I don't often feel like using masking fluid just because it takes so much time. I prefer to use just a smaller brush and make the background like this. So I've learned that technique from a teacher, a teacher at an interior design course many years ago. And back then she was showing us how to make those flat washes, perfectly flat washes on any shape when we were making, for example, design, like interior designs sketches. And I've been using this technique ever since. I absolutely love it. And nowadays for backgrounds, I use mostly this with the bigger brush. Sometimes I mask the painting, the shapes off. But when I don't, I still go back to this technique. And you've probably recognized it as well. So the way to do it is to put your board on an angle. So I'm putting this tape over here, like this, so that it has a slight, angle. The other thing is to kind of, you have to do it in one go. You can of course work on both sides, so start at the bottom and then just work on two sides at the same time. But I prefer to start on one side and go around just twisting my let's call it board as I go. So I will twist it depending, because the idea here is that the gravity has to do the most work. So I'm gonna show you. It will make more sense. Shall we use the red? I will use the red. I'm pre-mixing my paint, because once I start painting, I can't stop. This is just, and I'm purposefully showing, with the smaller brush, because that's what I've been doing a lot. You can definitely use a bigger brush if you have a brush like that, or if you prefer bigger brushes. For me personally, this was the brush that I've been using for painting for a very long time, so that's what I will use now. So I'm mixing my paint, and I'm starting over here, in this corner. I'm laying down the paint, like so. And I'm continuing to add the paint to just the bottom line. As you can see, the water is pooling at the bottom. I'm taking more paint and adding just that to that little bead of paint at the bottom of my wash. And as you can see, it's creating a perfectly even wash like that. Now it is tedious because of course you have to pay attention and you can't touch the surface that you've already painted on. It can also create sometimes some stripes, especially with paint that is a little bit more, has bigger grain, like ultramarine blue. I've had a lot of problems with ultramarine blue. And like this, when I'm starting to go to the corner, and I know I have to turn, I'm going to create another edge. I'm slowly turning it, always keeping that board at an angle. And just adding more paint, just making sure that bead is big. And I'm kind of guiding it to the bottom, I suppose. Turning it around again. Now this technique was giving me a lot of trouble in the early days of recording because that's when I've been using this technique a lot. And this is not the best technique to record just because you have to maneuver the board around, and the easiest way is of course to pick it up, but of course for the camera it's much better if it's laying flat so that everybody can see what's happening. Okay, just a few more strokes, and I'm literally just guiding that paint. There's nothing else happening. I'm just guiding the paint to the bottom, and that's it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the rest of the paint rather quickly. So I'm drying my brush, picking that paint up, drying again, and picking it up, and then letting this thing flow a little bit lower. I see this is really wet, so I'm going to pick that up as well. And that's it. Look how nice and flat that is. Of course, here I could pay more attention to the edges. This is just a explanation, just an example, so I wasn't paying too much attention to it. Okay, so the next thing I think we're gonna do is some gradients. Let me change the paper and I'll be right back. Okay, and we're back. I've taped down 2 more pieces, as you can see. These 2 are laying over here. They are a little bit curly, but that's because the paper is rather thin. So I've taped 2 more pieces. One of them is divided into 2 sections because I'm going to show you 2 different ways of creating the gradient that I usually use. And then on this side, we're going to do some wet on wet painting also in the same way I usually use it. I call it like lazy people way because these things are pretty much, foolproof. You probably know if you watch my videos that I don't like the idea that watercolors are out of my control. So the techniques I'm using are pretty much tailored for me to get the best results, that I want personally from watercolor. These are of course not the only ways to use it, so you have to do your own research and you have to find a way that's best for you. Yeah, enough preaching. So the first thing we're gonna do, I clean my brush. As you can see, it's nice and clean. And I'm going to perhaps start with this red. So and it got into the blue. It's okay. A little bit like that will not make any problems. So I'm starting with the idea here is that the first gradient will have 2 layers of color going from the color to white to transparent and then overlapping each other from separate ways. So how I start usually is that I will put on the basic color like so. And then when I go around here, I'm going to put my paintbrush in water, dab it just a little bit. Now this paint is really staining, so it might take a little bit to even it out. I'm gonna rinse it again. Rinse it again. I'm not really rinsing, I'm just putting it in water, so getting rid of a little bit of that pigment. And I'm going to dry this and go from the bottom and towards the top. Now, as you can see, we have a line here. This is not ideal, and after that I would probably put another layer just to cover it up a bit. So we might do that over here. Just like that. I'm gonna rinse it again. Made another line. That happens, especially with those colors that are really staining. Okay, and then I'm going to rinse that paintbrush again and do the same thing. So pick up the water as with the flat wash, and at the same time work on these colors making a nice gradient. Now, of course, I would prefer if there was a little bit less color at the bottom, but it doesn't really matter. You get the point. So while this dries, I'm going to work on this side. And for this, I'm going to use just the same big brush. I'm going to dip it in red and add my color. Quickly rinse it. Dip it in the extra mixed bowl, which is basically blue and red mixed together. And brush that on. Rinse it again and dip it in blue. Now, the reason why I really don't like this technique is because the color mix. And some colors just are not meant to mix. Like, for example, this one. I really dislike the way these two colors mix. So, but still, let's try to do our best here. A bit here. So it's basically a matter of working quickly. And trying to make sure there is no leftover paint. If this seems a little bit too light for you, it's always better to add another layer on top while this one is dry, rather than to just keep adding paint. This way you're gonna get a much more even result compared to just, adding paint on top of wet paints, because that's never too good. So for me personally, this looks a little bit muddy. I am not a fan. And especially that this side will also look muddy, but for me personally, it's easier to make. Okay, I'm going to dry that now. And I always let the paper cool off completely before I start painting another layer, just because, the paint will dry, of course, faster on warm paper. And the glue under the tape is softer due to the heat. So, it's going to, the paint might seep under the tape. So that's not exactly what we want. So I suppose while this is drying, we can start working on this side. And for this side, I'm going to show you how I do kind of like a wet on wet effect, but for colors that don't really mix well together. And the basic for that, I'm going to clean my paintbrush. The basic idea behind that is that similarly to this, you're going to put your paint in 2 layers. So you're going to let the paint mingle, but only on wet. So only... Okay, only in a wet, clear water. That's what I was looking for. I'm going to get rid of the most paint, the most water I can, so that, we don't overflow what we have. It's still gonna buckle, it's okay. And then I'm going to put a few drops of this blue. Nothing too fancy, just a few little drops of blue. Now, of course, bear in mind, this is not for when you really want to have nice color mixes between your chosen colors. I chose these colors on purpose because I really dislike the color combination, the color that is created from the mix of the two. So this one over here, this really weird gray color, is a mix of these two colors. They just don't mix into the good purple. But I still like to use them, so that's why I wanted to find a way for me to do that. And I just leave this to dry. I might dry it normally with a heat gun, but in this case I'm going to dry it naturally while we work on this one over here. So on this side I'm going to put a layer of blue again in the opposite direction, I'm sorry. While here we're going to enhance this existing gradient. I'm going to show you exactly once again what I'm doing because it has to be done really quickly, so it's really hard to explain. So let's first do this one. For this one, I have my brush pretty dry. I'm loading a little bit of paint, not too much. And I'm basically painting on a stripe of that color. Then I'm dipping that brush, just dipping, not rinsing, dipping it once in water, brushing it again, dipping it again, drying a little bit, so we don't want too much water, and then brushing again. Then I'm going to dry that on my paper towel, and from the red, pick up excess paint. I'm going to add a little bit more paint if necessary. Now I went a little bit too far in here, just because I'm so stressed making a demonstration. But the idea is so that on the edges you have only water. I had too much blue, and that red got a little bit covered by that very delicate hint of blue. And we are working here with basically transparency of watercolor. This is not going to work for all of the mediums. But because watercolors are so transparent, as you can see, I have now a perfect gradient just with 2 layers of color. Now I would definitely, once this dries, I would put another layer of red just to cover this ugly hint of blue. But in the meantime, we're going to do this gradient over here. So what I do before anything else, I want to, when I have my 2 colors, when I'm doing a gradient like this that's like in one go, I don't do it often. I'm just showing you for the comparison and how much more problematic it is for me. I have my red and blue, and then I mix those 2 colors in a 1:1 ratio to create like a middle tone so that I don't have to mix them on paper. You could, I just prefer it this way. So basically, I'm dipping my paintbrush in that red. I'm trying to mix it a little bit because these colors are rather heavy and you need to mix them. So I'm coming in from the blue, from the red. Then this same brush, I'm drying it, dumping it in the weird purple and putting it kind of overlapping the red. Like that. Then I'm drying it again and picking up the blue. Did I say purple? I don't even remember what I say anymore. I'm so concentrated. Like that. And as you can see now, after the second pass, the colors are much more vibrant. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, and to keep the colors really nice and clean, you want to go like this, to the middle, from the blue to the middle, rinse your brush, dry it, and go from the red to the middle again, so that you don't contaminate the colors. Okay? Okay, I guess it's drying time again. You guys are going to see me do lots of drying today. Once again, I'm letting it dry, and as you can see, this side is still much lighter. And I really don't like that I put a little bit of blue over this red, but it's okay. We can fix that. We can fix that. Now, on the first glance, might seem that this is an easier way to do gradients. I mean, it's faster. The effect is really nice. But to be quite honest, this is much more foolproof. There are so many things that can go wrong in this case. When you're working in a rectangle like this, it's actually much easier because you have only one motion. But in any other shape, it's much better for... I'm talking about myself here. I'm sure you guys know it by now. But for me personally, this is much better for working with different shapes, like circles, triangles, things like that, like different body parts, clothes, hair, just different parts that normally, don't have a rectangular easy shape. So I'm going to put another layer of red just to enhance it. I mean, it does take more layers in total before, but it only seemed really long, even to me right now. Okay, there is the red, rinsing the brush, drying, rinsing the brush, drying, and there we go. And this is where I should have stopped. This is where I should have stopped to let this blue be really vibrant and just blue. And I should have done the same thing with the red, but I didn't. Now, the one thing that happens here is that because these two colors don't really mix, they only overlap each other. So for me personally, this color combination has a much cleaner look than this one here, where there's the bigger part of colors mixing together. Now, of course, you could just put blue and red together and mix it, with the brush in the middle. But from my experience, it's just a little bit more problematic. Now, while this is drying, this one is already done. We're going to go back to this one over here. As you can see, in the meantime, I got these 3 weird splotches of blue that are not very attractive, but oh well. I'm going to wet the paper again to create nice canvas to work wet on wet in. I'm trying not to rub too much, not to activate this color underneath, although these colors are really staining, so I'm not really worried about that. And then I'm going back with maybe a little bit washed out version. No, I will show you just how it works. So as you probably noticed by now, I am more of a fan of not the colors mixing as much as I like to see how their transparency works. Most of the time, this is the way I'm going to create my backgrounds, just much lighter. This is, I've made this color on purpose a bit darker than what I normally would use, because much more pigmented as well, because it's easier to see, basically. And as you can see, I'm picking up the paint as much as I can, because this paint, if not paid attention to, is going to bloom on me, and I really dislike blooms. So yeah, let me dry this. So while this one cools off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this one. So the effect you're getting here is more of as if you were layering pieces of transparent glass on top of each other. As if it was a layer of blue glass with just white glass with blue splotches, and then on top of that, a white glass with red splotches on it, or the red design, or whatever you call it. So basically what you have in between is as if you were looking through a piece of that red glass. So you see the blue through the red. And that kind of really helps me sometimes with those colors that don't necessarily mix together, in my opinion. Bear in mind, in my opinion. Because this gives me kind of like, I find this effect much nicer than just the paint going muddy by itself without even me, having anything to do with it. It's just doing it. It's another one of those moments when I need to have some sort of say in what I'm painting. No, don't do that. Don't do that, paint. Okay. So the last layer of blue, same as before, full brush, brushing it on, rinsing, drying, brushing it on, rinsing, drying, and brushing it on. Then drying completely. Oh, a little bit too muddy. Yeah, that's the problem when you don't wash your brush. Oh, sorry for that. I hit the microphone. If you don't wash the brush properly. And there you have it. Yeah, this is not exactly the best idea, but you get the point. You get my point, right? I hope you do. Now, so on top of these, you have flat washes, you have gradients. I don't think I can say anything more about this topping, but if you have any more questions about this, please leave me a comment below. I highly appreciate it, and I will try to answer it as best as I can. And also, if you would consider leaving a like and maybe subscribing if you're not subscribed already, that would help me a lot as well. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it inspired you a little bit. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!